John Parker gripped the wheel of his weathered Chevrolet Bel Air, its red and white paint job faded under years of relentless sun. The roar of the engine, steady and comforting, was the only companion in his solitary journey through Arizona's desolate backroads. The endless stretches of asphalt, framed by vast deserts dotted with towering saguaros, reflected a sun so intense it seemed to burn the horizon itself. Each mile he drove carried him farther from the bustling cities, their noise and chaos now a distant memory, replaced by the serene isolation of the open road. At 74 years old, John had earned his solitude. Decades of service in the U.S. Navy, most of them as a SEAL, had left their marks, on his body, on his mind, and in the form of memories he sometimes wished he could forget. The long stretches of time he spent on the road now gave him the chance to reflect, not always comfortably, on the life he'd lived. His once dark hair was now silver, cropped short in a military style he never abandoned. His eyes, a steely gray, scanned the road ahead with the precision of a man who'd spent his life evaluating threats. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting the landscape in a fiery glow, John spotted a lone gas station ahead. The structure was a relic of a bygone era, rusted pumps, a dilapidated roof, and a faded sign that once proudly displayed its name, now barely legible under layers of grime. The place exuded abandonment, save for a small convenience store with flickering neon lights in its window and a lone attendant who sat slumped behind the counter. The young man inside looked as though he belonged to the dusty shelves, his head nodding to the muffled hum of a transistor radio. John pulled up to the pump, the car's tires crunching over loose gravel. The silence was thick, broken only by the wind that swept across the station, carrying with it the faint smell of oil and sand. He stepped out of the car, the heat hitting him like a wave, and adjusted his baseball cap. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple as he inserted the nozzle into the gas tank, the ancient pump groaning in protest as it began its work. His eyes scanned the surroundings, a habit ingrained after years of combat. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of orange and brown punctuated by jagged rock formations that seemed to defy time itself. In the distance, the heat shimmered, creating mirages that danced on the horizon. John felt a strange calm wash over him, a deceptive tranquility that reminded him of the moments before a mission would go sideways. As he waited, leaning against the car, his mind wandered. He thought about his old team, the missions that had defined his youth. There were faces he could still recall vividly. Charlie, always cracking jokes, Ramirez, the tactical genius, and Davis, the youngest, full of enthusiasm until the day it was snuffed out. The memories were bittersweet, mingling pride with a sense of loss that never truly left. His hand unconsciously moved to his side, brushing against the faded scar that ran along his ribcage, a reminder of a mission that had gone wrong in the Strait of Hormuz. The pump clanked to a halt, jolting him from his reverie. He replaced the nozzle and stretched his back, the ache in his joints a constant reminder of his age. Just as he was about to slide back into the car, a distant rumble caught his attention. At first, it was faint, barely distinguishable from the sound of the wind. But as the noise grew louder, John recognized the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines. From the far end of the road, a group of bikers appeared, their silhouettes blurred by the rising dust they kicked up. There were at least 4 of them, their black leather jackets and chrome-plated bikes gleaming ominously under the fading sun. They rode with an air of dominance, their formation tight as they approached the gas station. John's gaze sharpened. He could tell immediately that these weren't casual riders. The precision of their movements and the deliberate way they spread out as they entered the station spoke volumes. The leader, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his arms and neck, pulled his Harley to a stop just feet away from John's car. His presence was magnetic, radiating authority and danger in equal measure. His crew followed suit, their engines idling like predators sizing up their prey. The leader dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a weathered face framed by a shock of red hair. His cold eyes locked onto John with a curiosity that bordered on contempt. He didn't say anything at first, simply letting the moment stretch out as his men flanked him, their stances casual but unmistakably aggressive. John didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze evenly, his expression betraying nothing. It wasn't arrogance, but a calm forged through years of discipline and experience. He'd faced worse than this, a fact he didn't need to announce. His stillness alone was enough to unsettle anyone who knew what to look for. The attendant inside the store froze, his hands gripping the counter as he peered through the window. Clearly, he wanted no part of whatever was about to unfold. The radio crackled faintly in the background, the distorted voice of a country singer the only sound as the bikers and John stood locked in a silent standoff. The leader finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that carried over the noise of the bikes. "Well, what do we have here? A classic car and an old-timer. Out for a Sunday drive, Pops." His men chuckled, their laughter harsh against the backdrop of the empty desert. One of them, a wiry figure with a sneer plastered across his face, leaned against his bike and lit a cigarette, exhaling a plume of smoke that drifted lazily in the hot air. John remained quiet, his stance relaxed but deliberate. His hand rested lightly on the car door, not out of nervousness but readiness. His silence only seemed to provoke the leader further, who took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You deaf, old man? Or just rude?" The question hung in the air, a challenge more than an inquiry. The other bikers shifted slightly, their movements almost imperceptible but not lost on John's trained eye. He spoke at last, his voice steady and measured. "Just passing through. Don't want any trouble." The leader smirked, his expression twisting into something predatory. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We're just saying hello." The exchange was brief, but the tension it left in its wake was palpable. The desert, vast and indifferent, bore witness as John Parker stood alone against the encroaching storm. The low rumble of the motorcycles lingered, their engines growling as if waiting for an unspoken command. Dust swirled around the gas station, the waning sunlight casting long shadows of the men and their machines. John Parker stood unmoving, his weathered face giving no indication of the thoughts racing behind his steel-gray eyes. The leader of the group, Rave Red Thompson, loomed closer, his hulking figure partially eclipsing the setting sun. Tattoos spiraled up his neck, peeking out from under his leather jacket, each one a story of violence and dominance in his world. John's car, pristine in its age, seemed out of place among the scene that was unfolding. Red glanced at the vehicle, then at John, his lips curving into a smirk that carried no warmth. Behind him, his men, Mike, stocky and bullish, Chris, wiry and tense, and Bobby, whose unblinking gaze carried an unsettling energy, formed a loose semicircle, effectively blocking any route of escape. The attendant in the store disappeared deeper into the shadows of the building, pulling the blinds down with trembling hands. "You've got a nice set of wheels here," Red began, his voice rough with years of smoke and whiskey. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "A little out of your league, though, don't you think, Grandpa?" Mike let out a low chuckle, his laughter echoed by the others. Bobby adjusted his grip on the handlebars of his bike, while Chris cracked his knuckles loudly, his eyes darting between John and Red as though eager for what might come next. John didn't respond immediately. He'd learned long ago that silence could unnerve men like these more effectively than any retort. His calm demeanor wasn't arrogance, it was a calculated read of the situation. The bikers had all the bluster, but John's experience taught him to weigh every variable. He straightened, his calloused hands brushing against his jeans as he turned his gaze fully toward Red. "Just fueling up," John said finally, his tone even but firm. "I don't want trouble." Red's smirk widened, his eyes narrowing slightly as though dissecting the man before him. "Funny," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Trouble has a way of finding people who don't want it." Mike stepped forward, his heavy boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. "Maybe we're just being friendly," he added, his grin revealing a chipped tooth. "You don't look like the friendly type, though." John held their gazes, his hands resting loosely at his sides. The air between them grew thick with tension. He could see the impatience simmering in Chris, the way the wiry man shifted his weight, his fingers flexing as though itching for action. Bobby remained stoic, his arms crossed over his chest, but his silence only added to the oppressive atmosphere. The sun dipped further toward the horizon, bathing the scene in deep amber tones. The metallic groan of the gas station sign swaying in the wind added to the eerie stillness that had settled around them. John's instincts were screaming now, the years of training he had tried to leave behind roaring back with clarity. The placement of the men, their body language, the slight aggression in their movements, all told him that they were testing him, seeing how far they could push. "Nice car," Bobby said at last, his voice cutting through the silence. His tone was flat, but there was something menacing beneath it. "Bet it's worth a lot." John's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not for sale." Bobby's grin turned feral. "Didn't think we were talking about money." Red raised a hand, and Bobby fell silent. The leader stepped even closer now, stopping mere feet away from John. "I don't think you understand," Red said, his tone now devoid of humor. "We're just out here looking for a little fun. And you look like you could use some company." John didn't move. His calm demeanor belied the storm brewing inside him. "I've been alone by choice," he said, his voice like steel. "And I'd prefer to keep it that way." Red tilted his head, studying John as though searching for a crack in the veteran's armor. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" he mused, his voice quieter now but no less dangerous. "Most people would have already been begging to leave." John met Red's gaze, unblinking. "I've dealt with tougher." For a moment, silence blanketed the gas station. Then Chris, unable to contain himself any longer, barked a sharp laugh. "Tough guy, huh?" he said, stepping forward. "Maybe he needs a reminder that we run these roads." Red turned his head slightly, fixing Chris with a warning look. "Not yet," he said, his voice low. "Let's see how much fight he's got in him first." The leader's attention snapped back to John, his smile returning but without a trace of humor. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said. "Walk away now. Leave the car. And maybe, just maybe, we'll let you keep your dignity." John's jaw tightened. He felt the weight of the moment, the inevitability of what was coming. He'd spent years trying to leave this part of himself behind. The fighter, the survivor, the man who didn't back down. But now, standing under the darkening sky with these men circling him, he knew he had no choice. "I think you've misunderstood," John said evenly, his voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the oppressive tension. "I'm not leaving without my car." The silence that followed was deafening. Red's expression darkened, his smirk fading into a cold scowl. For a moment, no one moved. The bikers exchanged glances, their postures shifting as they prepared for what they knew was coming. Chris was the first to move, taking a sharp step forward, his fists clenched. But before he could get closer, Red held out an arm, stopping him in his tracks. "Patience," the leader said, his eyes never leaving John. "The old man wants to play. Let's make it interesting." The wind picked up, whipping through the station and carrying with it the promise of a storm, not of weather but of violence. John stood his ground, his heart steady, his mind clear. He had been here before, countless times. And as the bikers closed in, their confidence radiating from them in waves, he felt the familiar resolve settle over him. He wasn't just a man in a gas station anymore. He was a soldier, a SEAL, a force of nature. And these men, despite their bravado, had no idea what they were about to unleash. The tension in the air thickened, turning as heavy as the desert heat clinging to their skin. John stood in the center of the gas station lot, a lone figure dwarfed by the looming presence of the bikers. The sun, now dipping below the horizon, painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, the last traces of daylight casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The men surrounding him shifted, their aggressive postures telegraphing impatience as they waited for a signal from their leader. Red Ray Thompson finally broke the silence. He took a slow, deliberate step toward John, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. His predatory gaze didn't waver, but the hint of a smirk playing on his lips revealed a confidence born from years of intimidation and dominance. He was used to getting his way. This old man before him, with his weathered face and calm demeanor, was an anomaly he intended to crush. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Red said, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of a man who thrived on confrontation. "But guts only get you so far out here. John didn't flinch. His steady gaze locked onto Red's, his face impassive. The scars on his knuckles itched, remnants of battles fought and won in the distant past. Every fiber of his being screamed restraint, the soldier within him calculating angles, distances, and escape routes in case things went south. But he could feel the situation teetering on the edge, about to collapse into chaos. Chris, the wiry, impatient member of the group, couldn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the chain dangling from his belt loop. "Come on, Red," he said, his voice sharp with eagerness. "Let's teach this guy a lesson." "Shut up, Chris," Red snapped, not even sparing him a glance. The authority in his tone silenced the younger man, but the fire in Chris's eyes remained. He looked ready to pounce, like a dog barely restrained by its leash. Red turned his attention back to John. "You're a hard man to rattle. I can respect that. But respect doesn't mean you walk away. Not from me." John finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't want to fight you. Or your men. Walk away while you can." That drew laughter from the others. Mike, the burly enforcer of the group, clapped his hands together, his booming guffaw echoing across the lot. "You hear that, boys? The old man's giving us a warning." "Sounds like he's got a death wish," Bobby added, his tone colder, almost clinical. Red, however, didn't laugh. His smirk faded as his jaw tightened, the earlier amusement replaced by simmering anger. "You think you're the one in control here, don't you?" he said, stepping closer until he was just a foot away from John. "I'm gonna enjoy wiping that smug look off your face." John said nothing. His hands remained loose at his sides, his body language deceptively relaxed. But inside, his instincts were firing on all cylinders. He could see Red's muscles tense, his right hand twitch slightly, small tells that gave away the man's intent. John had seen it all before. He knew the fight was coming. It always did. Chris moved first, unable to contain himself any longer. He lunged forward, the chain in his hand swinging in a wide arc aimed at John's head. Time seemed to slow as John's training took over. With a fluid movement, he stepped back just enough to let the chain whip harmlessly through the air. Using Chris's own momentum against him, John grabbed his wrist mid-swing and twisted sharply. Chris let out a pained yelp as the chain clattered to the ground. Before the others could react, John pivoted, driving his elbow into Chris's sternum with precision. The younger man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. The bikers froze for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sudden display of skill. That moment of hesitation was all John needed. He turned to face the others, his stance shifting slightly, ready for the next attack. Red's face twisted into a snarl, his earlier calm shattered. "Get him," he barked, and the other men surged forward. Mike charged like a bull, his fists swinging wildly. John sidestepped the first punch with ease, grabbing Mike's arm and using the man's own weight to throw him off balance. Mike stumbled, his massive frame crashing into a motorcycle with a loud clang. Bobby followed, more calculated in his approach. He feinted with his right hand before aiming a powerful left hook at John's jaw. John ducked under the punch, stepping into Bobby's space. With a quick, controlled movement, he drove his knee into Bobby's abdomen, forcing the air from his lungs. Bobby staggered back, clutching his stomach, his eyes wide with disbelief. Red didn't wait. He pulled a knife from his boot, the blade gleaming in the dim light. His movements were faster, more disciplined than the others, a sign of experience, perhaps from a violent past. He lunged at John, slashing with precision. John narrowly avoided the blade, the edge grazing his sleeve but missing flesh. The fight became a dance of survival, each move deliberate and efficient. John deflected Red's attacks with calculated precision, his mind working 2 steps ahead. He grabbed Red's wrist mid-thrust, twisting it sharply and forcing the knife to clatter to the ground. Before Red could recover, John drove his palm upward into the man's jaw, the force snapping his head back. The others hesitated, clearly rethinking their confidence. Chris, still gasping on the ground, managed to sit up, his eyes wide with fear. Mike and Bobby exchanged glances, unsure whether to press on or cut their losses. Red, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, pushed himself to his feet. His expression was a mixture of fury and humiliation. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice thick with venom. John stepped back, his breathing steady despite the exertion. "I'm not the one who picked this fight," he said, his tone calm but laced with warning. The bikers regrouped, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. Red wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his chest heaving. For a moment, it seemed he might lunge again. But the look in John's eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger or fear, it was a cold, quiet certainty. The kind of look that came from a man who had seen death and walked away from it more times than he cared to count. "You got lucky," Red said finally, his voice low and bitter. He gestured to his men, who began to retreat reluctantly. Chris scrambled to his feet, clutching his side, while Mike helped Bobby limp back to their bikes. John watched them go, his body still tense, ready for another attack. The roar of their engines filled the air once more as they sped off into the desert, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint smell of gasoline. Only when they were gone did John relax, his shoulders dropping slightly. The attendant peeked out from behind the counter, his face pale. "Are you okay?" he stammered. John nodded, brushing the dust off his hands. "Just another day," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the fading growl of the motorcycles in the distance. The dust settled slowly, leaving the gas station shrouded in an eerie silence. John Parker stood in the aftermath, his senses still heightened, his breathing controlled but measured. His gaze swept the lot, lingering momentarily on the chain Chris had dropped and the scuff marks on the gravel where the fight had unfolded. The bikers' retreating growls had faded into the vast expanse of the desert, but John's instincts told him it wasn't over. Men like Red didn't back down easily, and they certainly didn't forgive humiliation. The attendant emerged cautiously from the convenience store, his face pale and his hands trembling. He opened the door just wide enough to speak, his voice wavering. "Mister, are you sure you're all right?" John glanced at him, his steel-gray eyes unreadable. "I'm fine," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it that discouraged further questioning. The attendant nodded quickly, retreating back inside like a mouse scampering for cover. John turned his attention to the horizon. The sun was gone now, replaced by the twilight's muted glow. Darkness crept in, swallowing the desert in shadows that seemed alive. He knew Red and his crew weren't gone for good. They'd regroup, perhaps bringing reinforcements. Men like that thrived on control, and losing it stung their pride like a scorpion sting. John knew the storm wasn't over, it was just gathering strength. He climbed into his car, the leather seat creaking under his weight. The familiarity of the Bel Air brought him a fleeting sense of normalcy, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel as he started the engine. The low growl of the motor was a reassuring sound, but he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him, hidden in the desert's endless expanse. He pulled onto the road, the headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The gas station receded in his rearview mirror, its flickering neon sign the last beacon before the road stretched into nothingness. John's mind was calm but focused, replaying the events of the past hour with precision. He analyzed each move, each reaction, and each man's demeanor. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. 10 miles down the road, the first signs of trouble appeared. His headlights caught the glint of something metallic in the distance. As he drew closer, he saw it, a line of motorcycles parked in a staggered formation, blocking the road like a barricade. The sight was a clear message. Red and his gang had been waiting. John slowed the car, his foot hovering over the brake. His pulse remained steady, his thoughts sharpening. The bikers stood in the middle of the road, their silhouettes stark against the dimming sky. Red was at the center, his arms crossed, his posture exuding confidence. Behind him, Mike, Bobby, and Chris stood ready, joined now by 3 new faces, reinforcements, just as John had predicted. Red stepped forward as John brought the car to a halt, the vehicle's headlights illuminating the men and casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. For a moment, no one moved. The desert wind howled softly, carrying with it the faint smell of gasoline and dust. Red's smirk returned, his earlier fury replaced with cold determination. "You didn't really think we were done, did you?" he called out, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "No one gets to embarrass me like that and just drive off." John remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He studied the men before him, noting their weapons, chains, bats, knives, and their postures. They were trying to intimidate him, but their movements betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. They didn't understand the man they were dealing with. "You can walk away," John said finally, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "No one else has to get hurt." Red barked a harsh laugh, his men joining in, though their mirth lacked conviction. "That's funny coming from you," Red replied, pulling a crowbar from behind his back. He spun it lazily in his hand, the metal catching the light as he stepped closer to the car. "But you don't get it, old man. This isn't about avoiding a fight. It's about showing you your place." John exhaled slowly, his breath misting slightly in the cool night air. He knew what was coming. He'd faced worse odds in the past, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't soldiers. These were men driven by ego and rage, dangerous but undisciplined. He pushed open the car door and stepped out, the crunch of his boots on the gravel breaking the silence. The bikers tensed as he straightened to his full height, his frame lean but imposing. The weight of his experience hung in the air around him, an intangible force that made even the new men hesitate. "Last chance," John said, his voice low and steady. "Turn around. Go home." Red's grin twisted into a snarl. "Enough talk." The first man charged, a newcomer wielding a bat. He swung wildly, his movements telegraphed and clumsy. John sidestepped the attack with ease, his movements fluid and precise. Grabbing the man's wrist, he twisted sharply, forcing him to drop the bat with a pained cry. A quick strike to the man's chest sent him sprawling to the ground, gasping for air. The others hesitated, their earlier bravado faltering. But Red wasn't about to let them back down. "Get him!" he roared, his voice dripping with fury. They came at him all at once, a chaotic flurry of fists, chains, and blades. But John moved like water, his actions honed by years of training and survival. He ducked, dodged, and countered with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. A chain whipped through the air, missing him by inches as he spun and delivered a devastating elbow to its wielder's jaw. Another man lunged with a knife, but John caught his arm, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. A swift kick to the knee sent the attacker crumpling in pain. Red watched, his expression darkening with each man who fell. He charged at last, the crowbar swinging in a wide arc. John ducked under the blow, stepping into Red's space and delivering a powerful uppercut that sent the leader staggering backward. The fight was over in minutes. The bikers lay scattered across the road, groaning in pain. Red knelt on the asphalt, clutching his ribs, his earlier confidence shattered. John stood over him, his breathing steady, his eyes cold. "Stay down," he said simply. Red glared up at him but didn't move. The wind howled again, carrying away the echoes of the fight. John turned, stepping back into his car. The engine roared to life, and he drove forward, weaving through the fallen men and their bikes. The darkness swallowed him once more, leaving the broken gang behind. The desert stretched out before John Parker, a boundless expanse of darkness broken only by the faint glow of moonlight on the horizon. The rhythmic hum of his car's engine filled the void, but his mind was anything but calm. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, every muscle in his body tense as the adrenaline coursing through him began to fade. The night was still, yet his senses remained sharp, attuned to every sound, every shift in the air. He replayed the encounter in his mind, the bikers' arrogance, their blind confidence, and the chaos that had unfolded on that isolated stretch of road. Despite his calm exterior, John knew the danger he faced wasn't over. Men like Red didn't stop until they felt vindicated or utterly defeated. Judging by the fury in Red's eyes as he'd knelt in the dirt, John suspected the gang's leader wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. The thought lingered as he pressed onward, the Bel Air eating up the miles between him and the wreckage he'd left behind. The road twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the desolate terrain, where the desert seemed alive with an ominous energy. The headlights carved a narrow path through the night, illuminating only what was directly ahead. The rest of the world remained cloaked in an oppressive darkness that pressed against him like a tangible force. John's instincts, honed through decades of service, refused to let him relax. He glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind him for any signs of pursuit. The asphalt stretched empty, the faint shimmering heat of the day replaced by the cool, unrelenting grip of the desert night. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe he'd left them behind, that they'd learned their lesson and wouldn't come after him again. But that hope was short-lived. In the distance, he caught a flicker of movement, an unnatural glow that stood out against the moonlit landscape. His jaw tightened as he recognized it for what it was: headlights. Not just one, but several, their beams growing brighter as they gained ground. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. John's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. He had been hunted before, by men far more dangerous and skilled than Red's gang. His training took over, his mind working rapidly to assess his options. The Bel Air was powerful, its engine capable of outrunning most vehicles from its era. But against a pack of motorcycles built for speed, the odds weren't in his favor. He pushed the accelerator, the car surging forward with a low growl. The headlights behind him grew smaller for a moment, but the bikers weren't giving up. The roar of their engines carried across the desert, a primal sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. They were closing in, and fast. Up ahead, John spotted a narrow dirt road branching off from a highway, partially obscured by a row of jagged rocks. It was risky, untamed terrain that could damage the car or worse, but it was his best shot at shaking them. Without hesitation, he jerked the wheel, the tires skidding briefly as the car veered onto the rugged path. The Bel Air bucked and jolted over the uneven ground, dust and gravel kicking up in its wake. The roar of the motorcycles followed him, the bikers taking the turn with practiced ease. John could see their headlights weaving behind him, the pack moving as a single, relentless unit. He gritted his teeth, the vibration of the rough terrain rattling through the car's frame. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He needed to outthink them. The dirt road twisted sharply, the edges flanked by towering rock formations that cast jagged shadows in the moonlight. John navigated the treacherous path with precision, his hands steady on the wheel despite the punishing terrain. The bikers, confident in their advantage, gained ground, their engines screaming as they pushed their machines to the limit. John spotted an opportunity up ahead, a narrow gap between two massive rock formations, just wide enough for the Bel Air to squeeze through. It was a gamble, but one he was willing to take. He steered toward the opening, the car scraping against the rough stone as he forced it through. The sound was jarring, metal grinding against rock, but the car emerged on the other side, battered but still running. The bikers weren't as lucky. The gap was too narrow for their formation, forcing them to scatter. Two of them miscalculated, their bikes clipping the rocks and spinning out of control. The rest managed to regroup, but the brief delay gave John precious seconds to increase his lead. He pressed on, the dirt road leveling out as it opened into a wide expanse of desert. The moonlight illuminated a stretch of open land, broken only by scattered cacti and the occasional boulder. John knew the advantage was his now. The bikers had lost their cohesion, and the terrain favored a driver with skill and patience. But Red wasn't giving up. The gang leader's bike appeared in John's rearview mirror, closer than the others. He was relentless, his determination burning like a flame that refused to be extinguished. John could see the fury in his movements, the way he pushed his machine harder, faster, closing the gap inch by inch. John swerved suddenly, kicking up a plume of dust that obscured Red's vision. The gang leader faltered, his bike skidding as he struggled to regain control. John seized the moment, veering sharply toward a boulder and slamming the brakes. The car came to a jarring halt, the tires digging into the dirt. He killed the headlights and stepped out, disappearing into the shadows. Red and his remaining men tore through the dust cloud, their headlights scanning the open desert. They slowed, their confusion palpable as they searched for the car. John watched from his hiding spot, his breathing steady, his mind focused. He waited, his eyes locked on Red, who had stopped his bike and was shouting orders to the others. John moved silently, his years of training turning him into a ghost in the night. He approached the closest biker, who had dismounted to inspect a nearby area. The man didn't see him coming. With a swift, controlled movement, John struck, a precise blow to the man's neck, rendering him unconscious. The others were too spread out to notice. John moved quickly, methodically, taking down another before they realized what was happening. By the time Red caught on, 2 of his men were already out cold. "Where are you, old man?" Red bellowed, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. His bravado was tinged with uncertainty now, the earlier confidence giving way to frustration. John stepped into the light, his expression calm but unyielding. "Right here," he said. Red charged, his fury driving him forward, but John was ready. The battle was quick and brutal, each of Red's wild strikes met with a precise counter. When it was over, Red lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his men scattered and broken around him. John stood over him, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. "This is over," he said, his voice cold. "Don't follow me again." Without waiting for a response, John turned and walked back to his car. He started the engine and drove off into the night, the desert swallowing him whole. The desert was still again, the chaos of the chase fading into the cool silence of the night. John Parker drove onward, the Bel Air battered but resolute, carrying its lone passenger deeper into the endless expanse. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of gravel and brush, their beams steady even as the car bore the scars of the confrontation. John's hands gripped the wheel firmly, his focus unwavering, though the weariness of the night began to creep into his body. His mind was calm, but the weight of the events lingered. He knew he had ended things decisively with Red and his gang, yet a faint unease remained. Men like Red thrived on revenge, and even broken pride could be enough to ignite dangerous ambition. Still, John couldn't let his thoughts dwell there. He had made his stand. If they dared to come again, he would be ready, just as he always had been. The road began to smooth out, leading him toward the faint glow of a distant town. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, where the hum of neon signs and the chatter of a small diner marked the height of activity. John didn't need much: a quiet corner, a place to gather himself, and a chance to blend into the anonymity that only small towns could offer. The glow grew brighter as he approached, the outlines of weathered buildings emerging from the shadows. He parked the car at the edge of town, beneath the flickering light of an old street lamp. The Bel Air groaned softly as the engine shut off, its work done for the night. John stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement as he surveyed his surroundings. The streets were quiet, most of the town's inhabitants likely asleep or tucked away in the few open establishments. A neon sign buzzed in the window of a diner across the street, its red light spelling out open 24 hours. The door chimed softly as John entered, the warm smell of coffee and fried food wrapping around him. The diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and a trucker nursing a cup of coffee in the corner booth. John slid into a seat near the window, his back to the wall, his instincts compelling him to keep the room in view. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a tired smile, approached with a notepad in hand. "Long night?" she asked, her voice carrying the faint drawl of the region. John nodded. "You could say that." She offered a sympathetic smile. "Coffee, please." "Black." She scribbled the order and disappeared behind the counter. John exhaled, leaning back in the booth. The adrenaline had finally ebbed, leaving a dull ache in his muscles. His body, though still capable, reminded him of its age. He glanced at his reflection in the window, the ghost of a younger man staring back at him. The years had changed him, but the core of who he was remained untouched: a fighter, a survivor, a man who refused to back down. The waitress returned, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "Anything else?" she asked. John shook his head. "This'll do for now." "Thanks." She nodded and walked away, leaving him to his thoughts. He sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding him as he gazed out at the empty street. The events of the night replayed in his mind, not as regrets or fears, but as a reminder of what he had faced and overcome. Red and his gang had underestimated him, as so many had before. They saw an old man, but they didn't see the years of training, the discipline, the quiet strength honed through countless trials. The trucker in the corner stood, tossing a few bills on the table before tipping his hat to the waitress. He left, the door chiming softly behind him, and the diner grew even quieter. John welcomed the solitude. He didn't crave recognition or acknowledgement. He had fought his battles and made his peace with the life he'd led. Now, all he wanted was the freedom to move forward without the weight of his past dragging him down. But freedom, he knew, was rarely given. It was fought for, earned, and sometimes taken at great cost. A sudden sound broke the quiet, a low rumble, faint but growing. John's ears perked, the familiar noise stirring his instincts. He turned his gaze to the window, his eyes narrowing as the sound became clearer. Motorcycles. His grip tightened around the coffee cup as he spotted the approaching lights, their beams cutting through the night like knives. The bikes pulled into view, stopping just outside the diner. There were 3 of them, their riders dismounting with deliberate movements. They weren't Red's men, not the ones John had dealt with earlier, but their posture and the way they scanned the area told him they were connected. Reinforcements, perhaps, sent to finish what the others couldn't. John remained seated, his expression unreadable as he watched them through the window. The waitress glanced nervously toward the door, sensing the tension that had entered the air. "Friends of yours?" she asked cautiously. "No," John said, his voice steady. "Stay behind the counter." She hesitated, but the look in his eyes convinced her. She retreated to the far end of the diner, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The door chimed again as the 3 men entered. They were younger, leaner, their leather jackets bearing the same insignia as Red's gang. The leader, a wiry man with sharp features, scanned the room before his gaze settled on John. He smirked, the arrogance of youth evident in every step he took toward the booth. "You're Parker, right?" the man said, his tone casual but laced with menace. "Red sends his regards." John didn't respond immediately. He placed the coffee cup down with deliberate care and met the man's gaze. If Red had any sense, he'd let this go. The smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "Red doesn't let anything go. And neither do we." The man reached for something beneath his jacket, a knife, perhaps, or a weapon of a different kind, but John moved faster. In a single motion, he rose from the booth and closed the distance between them, his movements swift and decisive. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing him to drop the blade that clattered to the floor. The other 2 moved in, but John was ready. The fight was brutal and efficient, his years of training evident in every strike and counter. The small diner became a battleground, tables overturned and chairs sent skidding across the floor. When it was over, the 3 men lay sprawled and groaning on the tiled floor, their earlier confidence shattered. John stood over them, his breathing steady, his expression calm. "Go back to Red," he said coldly. "Tell him to stop sending boys to do a man's job." Without waiting for a response, he tossed a few bills on the counter, nodded to the stunned waitress, and walked out into the night. The Bel Air waited for him, its engine rumbling softly as he climbed inside. He drove off, the desert once again swallowing him whole, leaving only the echo of his presence behind. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.